All right, guys. I think this is like the 11th installment of our review of Augustine's On Free Choice of the Will. We have another session coming in after, so we just have to jump right into it.
Right.
But before I jump right into it, I'm going to have to sort of give this sort of preamble because, like I always do, I review what we did in the last podcast. And before I launch into that, maybe I should cede the floor to you because I have a tendency to dominate up front. Was there anything from the last podcast that you would like to discuss first?
Yeah. One question when I was, listening back was, and this is just like a minor point. Can you clarify what you meant by God's hyper time?
Yeah, and I think about that a lot, and maybe that was not the most eloquent way to express it. But when I think about hyper time, I think about something that's sort of beyond and above. But I think that has like a sci-fi sort of reference where it implies some sort of time traveling or something like that. So maybe I should speak about hyper time in terms of like meta time or something like that. I mean, so when I was talking about divine foreknowledge, what God knows, the course of human events, and the way that our sort of temporal timeline unfolds or whatever, I was using the hyper time or maybe meta time in this respect to say that the rivulets of human time can go in an infinite amount of directions, but there is a divine plan that certain things will be imposed upon those incidental and contingent aspects of human time. So regardless of what humans choose to do, God will allow for himself to be divinely incarnated in Christ at a particular time in our history.
Okay, that makes sense.
Despite what humans choose to do, the apocalypse and the resurrection and all these other things I'm considering as being part of meta time, God will impose upon it. Now, there may be different rivulets, right, where maybe Hitler doesn't come to power in 1933, but instead someone like him comes to power in 1953. Right. Or maybe there's a world war happening right now in a concurrent timeline in a parallel universe or something like that. But regardless of all these parallel universes where the things are different, Christ is always going to intercede and the resurrection is always going to happen and that the rapture will always happen. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
What was unclear about it to you when I talked about hypertime before?
Just honestly, the connotation of it, just kind of like what you said with like the sci-fi. I mean, to me, it almost seemed like time and overdrive. So I thought, I should have, I should have asked, in retrospect, I should have asked for clarification in the last podcast, but no time like the present.
Yeah, it was a bad choice of words, but it happened spontaneously. So, and that's the thing, we don't really script any of this out. It happens, and then we just kind of go for it and try to make up for it where we can. These podcasts are frozen in time, and they're constantly sort of evolving as well. So I actually have stuff that's sort of relevant to that, but I'll hold off on it unless there's more that you wanted clarification on.
That's good. That was my main point of contention.
All right, so I'm glad that you opened that up because it allows me to go into one of the major things that I thought was problematic about last podcast. And I got really hung up on these questions of, like, there were points in the podcast where I'm just, like, grasping and trying to explain all these problems and that are brought about by thinking about meta time, foreknowledge, time before creation, right? And I've done some research on this issue, and I went into iTunes U, and I found some great sort of overviews of Augustine by a professor named Dr. S. Donald Forston III. He did 2 lectures in iTunes U that you can find through. Actually, there's an app. There's a Reformed Theological Seminary app that you can get all these on. I think it's only meant for seminarian students, but because I found sort of a back way entrance into it, I was able to download the app, and now I get to have a seminary education for nothing. So I imagine maybe now that they know that I have hijacked their app, they were going to make it private to their students. I don't think they want people to know that there's this app out there with all this teaching, but is a phenomenal resource, the RTS theological app. It has sermons and systematic theology and whatnot. And they have this great professor, Dr. S. Donald Forston III, and he gave 2 lectures that I went over, Augustine and the City of God, and Augustine and Pelagius. I don't know if you know Pelagius very well, but he was a...
Rings a bell, vaguely.
Yeah, so Augustine took up a lot of early theological debates with him. And apparently, Augustine knew that he inadequately addressed the concepts of time and temporality and divine time foreknowledge on Free Choice of the Will. And we were talking earlier about how on Free Choice of the Will really could generate 10 books with all its topics.
Easily.
Yes. But so he says he has this sort of facetious answer to individuals like myself who get paralyzed by questions of time. In the Confessions, chapter 12, on what God did before the creation of the world, Augustine says, "Behold, I answer to him who asks, what was God doing before he made heaven and earth? I answer not as a certain person is reported to have done facetiously, avoiding the pressure of the question. He was preparing hell, saith he, for those who pry into mysteries." So that was kind of like the stock answer that Augustine gave for people like myself who are just like getting super obsessed with how all these...
hung up on it.
Yeah, there's like, if you're asking those questions, like you're not being faithful enough. But then Augustine does take up these issues more explicitly. Like we've seen like in many passages on Free Choice of the Will where he's like, oh, come on, that's... You're going too deep, but then he will spend a whole book. Like if we get hung up on questions of the Trinity, he'll go write a book on the Trinity. If we get hung up on questions of time and whatnot, he goes writes on that. And I would say I do think it's possible to develop a proper schematization of time and divine foreknowledge. I'll just put this out there. If there's anyone watching who's part of an academic institution or something like that, I would love to give a talk on that, and maybe Jordan could give the response or something like that.
Knows?
That would be absolutely phenomenal. Okay, so the second thing I wanted to go on to is to help give me a better background information for On Free Choice of the Will, and I was telling this to Jordan on our way over to today's podcast, is that I found a great resource through LibriVox, there's actually a full-on recording of Augustine's City of God. It takes like 42 hours to go through, and this great guy down in Texas named Darren L. Slider, on his own volition, his own voluntary will, created this for LibriVox. It's in the public domain. Anybody can access it. It's really wonderful. My only critique of it is that he kind of gallops and reads it very quickly, and which is sort of ironic because I'm probably galloping and reading too quickly as I'm trying to explain all this stuff. And there were two really interesting points that I wanted to draw from that. And the first, do you remember last time where I asked you about how God and the universe relate, and if one preceded the other, if they happen instantaneously? And
right, with creation, and I completely stalled out on that one.
Well, you kind of expressed sympathy to the idea that maybe God and the universe are like one entity and happened at once, right?
Right, and then I think your reply was something to the effect of, well, they have to be separate because how can God order the universe?
Right, and Augustine takes up this issue again as well, and he also says, because it's possible for humans to sin, if God was the universe and you and I are part of the universe, then God would be sinning as a part of the universe, so then you would have a God that would be capable of sin. And so Augustine's not, for that reason alone, there's going to be a multitude of reasons why Augustine's not going to be interested.
That's the linchpin.
But that's going to be a big deal and related to a lot of what we're going to talk about today and sin and stuff like that. So I thought that was really interesting. And I got that from the first 7 or 8 books of the LibriVox audio book, which I highly recommend. And then something else, Jordan has been, and I've told her this many times, I'm going to say it on camera too, Jordan has been creating video modules for... on Free Choice of the Will. And look, I understand, like, my style is like not supreme and the best and going to appeal to everybody. Jordan is so accessible, and what she is building for Noetic in terms of the video modules, I really couldn't be more proud of what you've made, because the perspective that you bring to it is something that I wouldn't have brought to it. And one of the things that you did really, really well in the video modules that you're doing, I totally overlooked how Augustine addresses the issue of sexual assault, and how that affects the victim. And he spends time on Free Choice of the Will addressing that. And I'll see the floor. Maybe tell people a little bit about that.
So in my module, doing all the preparatory work and all that good stuff, I got really hung up on chapter 5. And I kind of reached this impasse, and I thought, well, you know, a lot of these ideas are so backwards. But then as I read through the text really carefully, I think it was Evodius, and he said, you know, who could doubt that chastity is located in anywhere but the soul? And that stood out to me so much, because you have these two ideas really contrasting with one another. The idea that your physical integrity is not something that you should hold on to, which is something that we hold on to very dearly. And the modern notion that the idea of, sort of the victim shaming or guilting of, oh, well, that's really unfortunate that happened. What were you wearing?
Yeah.
That sentiment.
Yeah.
So the idea, or the notion rather, that Evodius and Augustine say, well, the chastity's in the soul, so even if your physical integrity it's taken from you by threat of violence and sexual assault, then you're still a chaste person, which I thought was just really profound and really sympathetic. So, you know, perhaps we could learn a thing or two really from Augustine and Evodius in that regard.
Yeah, incredibly forward-thinking. And what I wanted to let you know is that in City of God, he even develops those themes even more. Yeah, to preserve
really
this.
Want to read
yeah,
that.
And it's really awesome. He develops them even more to preserve the sanctity of woman. Mm-hmm. And I think it's pretty essential reading if you're interested in those issues.
And I think it's important to note that Augustine actually had a common law marriage. It wasn't necessarily a legal or sort of, you know, sanctified law, legal marriage, because she was a servant. But and that probably informed a lot of his worldview about women, because we could say that his idea of original sin was like disastrous for women, but sort of the converse of that, the things that he says about women are actually really positive.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Okay. And there was one more preamble thing that I wanted to address here. And this goes back a little bit further. So I've been, as I've been developing the Noetic app, I've had to go over my lecture notes to get them properly recorded and cleaned up and prepare them for hypertext so that people can follow along with them. And the idea is that what we're developing here with the podcast, these are sort of like breakout sessions and discussions that people can use to enrich my very efficient lectures. But what I did is I went back, and I think at some point in maybe like in episode 4 or 5 of our discussion, we started to think that when we were trying to conceive of the Augustine schematization of the cosmic order, we talked about animals having a will. And as I went back over my lecture notes, I couldn't find Augustine stipulating that animals had a will. But given the way that he schematizes it, you wouldn't be incorrect to draw that conclusion, I think. Right. And so I searched all over JSTOR, the internet. I'm looking all over the place for a definitive answer, because we reached out. You remember in the podcast, we reached out. We were like, we're stuck.
Yeah, we asked for like a lifeline on that one. We were like, please help us, please.
We were able to determine that animals have some sort of ability to choose, but we weren't able really to determine if they're overly determined by their instincts and their desires, and if we could talk about a restrained will and all that. And the fact of the matter is, it's not really addressed all that well. Mm-hmm. And I just on Saturday night, I just broke down. And I was just like, I'm going to figure this out. And I'm looking all over the place. I can't find anything. And so I start emailing Augustine experts. Do animals have a will? And I heard back from a leading luminary, and I haven't gotten his permission to use his name in what we're doing. So, but he did direct me towards some resources if individuals are interested in this. There is a massive online Augustine project that I had no idea existed. It's called the Augustinus Lexicon, AUGUSTINUS hyphen LEXIKON, and it's in like 3 different languages. I think German, Swedish, and English. And it's just anything relating to Augustine scholarship one can find there. And apparently there is an article on Animal that addresses some of these particular issues. I couldn't find it in English.
No.
Did you have a chance to look at it?
No, I think maybe we could like mess around with Google Translate though.
Yeah, I don't know how.
Let's hope.
Yeah, I don't know how good the Google Translate is.
Yeah, I mean, it would just. Who knows? Probably not that.
But that would be a place to look if you're interested in that. He also recommended a book that kind of shapes the landscape of antiquity's view of the animal will and soul and stuff like that. And it's by A. Deal. Last name is Deal, D-I-H-L-E. Theory of the Will in Antiquity. So I imagine it's not going to just deal with Augustine. It will deal with Plato and Aristotle and other people's views of the will, but we should find an answer in there. But this scholar did give me a little hint about his own personal view. He did say that he thought it was sort of telling that Augustine remains sort of silent on the notion of there being an animal will. Now, is that an endorsement for there not being an animal will? Does that mean that maybe the animal will is latent in some way? And we were talking, as we were having lunch, we talked about, well, maybe the presence of reason in humans entices the will to emerge. It was just there all along in more animalistically determined beings. But that is a massive area for research. So we're 16 minutes in, my preamble. Yeah. Now we can start to talk about...
Now we can get to the good stuff.
All right, so now we can talk about what we're going to cover today. And I think we're going to try to cover book 3, chapter 16 through 22. All right, I got to look over my notes so you do some talking.
Okay, yeah, so we can just kind of begin with, why don't we just do it chronologically?
Yeah.
So Augustine basically opens up with this chapter saying, God owes us nothing. And I thought this was such an interesting concept because when we think about, like karma, and I think, like I picked up a piece of trash off the side of the road, so I'm feeling pretty good about myself, and the universe is gonna pay me back for it. And Augustine doesn't agree with this sentiment at all, and he pretty much says that we owe God for our existence, and we shouldn't begrudge him for the form that we're in. And basically, God doesn't owe us any favors. And in fact, we owe pretty much everything to him. So I thought that was kind of a nifty departure on how I usually think about things.
So the idea being like pretty much that, like, despite how crappy you feel like your life may be, like, you should be grateful that you exist at all within the divine schematization.
Right.
And then if you go out, and by the mere fact that you exist, you ought to perform virtue as sort of because you're indebted to God for putting you within this divine order to begin with.
Right.
And that's the only reason why you ought to do it.
Right.
Now, if God chooses to save you, through Christ or to punish you or something like that, like, you can do no amount of virtue that you try to do. Like, for the fact, like, we may view Noetic as like this virtuous humanitarian contribution to the world or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, like, this is a droplet in the goodness of God. And like, really, we don't affect the grand scheme of things like one way or the other. So like, we can't get puffed up with intellectual pride for what we consider to be an academic and humanitarian sort of, it would be like giving Donald Trump a penny. It would be like nothing for him. So like, really, we're just doing it for the sake of virtue.
Right, and this is from 3:15, but I thought it really hit the nail on the head here. If it, meaning the soul, does not pay its debt by doing justice, it will pay its debt by suffering misery.
Right. And then the other thing is, so you may say, great, what if fine, I can't really make any contribution to the good or whatever. This is just something I'm sort of indebted to do. Well, I'll just go be bad, right? I'll just sin.
Exactly. Just say, oh, well, whatever, I'm here, so I might as well just have some fun.
Yeah, I can't earn my way into heaven, right? I can't buy the stairway to heaven or whatever. There is the punishment thing too. But also the converse of this is that not only can we not really add to God's greatness, no amount of sin can detract from God's greatness too.
Right. Yeah.
So even if all of humanity were to sin, just
completely rebel.
If we take this time, one of these alternate timelines where everyone is just totally depraved, there are no good men or women within us or something like that. No sweat off God's back. He'll just punish everybody and bring back.
And just restore that balance.
Yeah, he'll use justice to tune the perfect harmony of the universe, right? So like, that's the other thing that's really cool. It's like God is impenetrable to the acts of man.
And not to mention, because he even makes a point to all the people with original sin that say, "Oh well, Adam and Eve did this, and it's really not my fault. So I'm pretty innocent in my own sin." And he even kind of he gets kind of sassy, right, with the people that assume that, because he's just like, "No, you're still on the hook for this because you have free will. Adam and Eve might have put you in this place, but you can crawl out of the hole, and you are totally culpable." If you choose not to crawl out of it. Yeah.
And we're going to have to talk a lot more about Adam and Eve and original sin. We are getting to that today.
Finally.
But one of the things I thought was sort of interesting, and I don't want to gloss over this, do you remember in chapter 16 through 17, he actually talks about when we hold people accountable, right? Like when we say, like, look, like, you did wrong, you're sinning, or like when we say, or we laud people for doing the right thing, in a way, we are reaffirming that divine order or something like that. Do you remember him saying that? Like, yeah,
it's kind of like it
and
reinforces
and the debt that we have to God. Yeah. So, is that obvious? I have in my notes to draw that out some.
I mean, I think that Evodius does a good job bringing it to attention when he asks the question, how does the will or the cause of the will create that split of the beings that can sin but choose not to, the intermediates of like humans, of who sin sometimes but not always, and then those who are persistent in sinning. And I mean, he describes it, but I don't know to what extent he fully fleshes it out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll develop it, but I mean, I just thought this was kind of interesting that, like, when we call people out on their BS, like when people mess with us, and like that, like in a way, we are holding them to the divine standard. I just thought that was sort of interesting. I don't really think about it when I'm like, it kind of adds an extra sort of moral imperative for moral judgment, right? Like when we stand up for ourselves, or when we defend the weak, or we see injustice practicing or whatever, like that, in a way, what we're doing is like we're saying, no, there is God and there is a cosmic order. We're not just saying this is wrong or right. We're saying a lot more when we make those judgments, and perhaps that's why people are, I notice in the culture, especially among maybe younger people, and maybe you could speak to this, since I'm an old man, is that I hear a lot of people that are like, I'm just really not into judgment, or how dare you judge me, or this or that. What Augustine is saying here, when we are making judgments, like we are, and we are sort of matched up to that eternal law, like we're bringing a whole cosmic order to bear on another individual.
Yeah, and that's super interesting.
What do you think
you
about
mentioned that? Because I think it might have been in 18 that he makes this gesture towards this idea of natural judgment. So it's something that is inherent in us, and he says that we have this inclination, right, to prefer wisdom to error and peace to difficulty. And I think that that's something that's kind of latent in us. So that's super interesting that you mentioned that it's like bringing this sort of like cosmic judgment, like crushing down on someone.
Yeah, we are bringing all of it.
Yeah, because then it begs the question, is it something that natural judgment, is that something that we just inherently have? Did we get that sort of along with part and parcel with original sin?
Right, and I think there are a lot. I think there are a lot of people that make the argument that that every individual is familiar with the divine cosmic order and these natural judgments and things like that. And a lot of theologians, a lot of Christian theologians, think that this is sort of how humans sort of naturally act. And if we can speak to this, maybe we can get them to sort of trace their judgment back to there being a God and make them reconcile with God, since they're so inclined to say, like, you know, whatever the question, like, we make all sorts of judgments. Like, some people say that it's like, it's wrong that there's such wealth inequality in this country, or that it's wrong that abortion is permitted. Whatever they're all different sorts of judgments, but it's all sort of like traced back to this sort of like understanding of like the proper sort of cosmic order, and if we can get people to see that, maybe it might make them more inclined to think that there's a God.
Right, and we can tie the will back into this because he says that the root of all evil is, he kind of does this whole, like, I don't know, trickle-down effect, but he basically gets to the conclusion that it's a perverse will, and he says that a perverse will is contrary to nature.
Yeah.
So...
Well, how do you feel when people judge you? Are you okay with people saying, you know, Jordan, you really messed up here? Or how do you feel about judging other people? You're younger, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm very okay with judgment. When people say that I'm judgmental, I'm just like, yeah, I am. I really, the way that I look at it, because I sort of embrace this worldview, is that I really want to be known as the most judgmental person around.
Right.
The problem with being judgmental is if it's arbitrary to your relativized standard. What we hope is that our judgments are discerning of this ultimate cosmic order and that we're aligned with it. I want to make sure that my judgments are properly ordered with wisdom and God. So I want people to call me judgmental because that's what I'm aiming for.
Right, and I think a lot of it depends on connotation, but I think one of my favorite, I guess you could say, like, I don't know, aphorisms or adages, whatever you'd like to call it, is, and this is just something I like to live by, is judge not lest ye be judged.
Yeah. So that's going against everything I just said.
So it's funny because maybe it's a generational thing, but for me, it's what someone does in their private life, their public life, that's sort of between them and whatever higher being that they believe in. So,
I suppose I don't want
to me, it's interesting because for me, I almost resign myself saying, like, hey, I'm not God. I'm not one to judge.
Well, the thing is,
because I feel like I can't really convey that sort of divine authority. I mean, as a moral and ethical person, I can try to, but my own limitations of understanding, I'm never going to be the direct, line to God. So for me, I'm always hesitant to judge. Usually I like to operate off of facts first and then get a complete story, but judge not lest ye be judged.
Well, I guess the thing is,
sort of life code
for me is like, I don't necessarily want other people constantly reprimanding me, but I do want God to hold me accountable.
Right.
So I guess when I make judgments of wrong and right and sort of instruct people about sort of getting back onto the right path, I hope that God is sort of working within me and judging me to get back on the right path as well too.
Right.
But I certainly know that I'm imperfect and a sinner and going, and that I ultimately want God to be merciful in his judgment one day when I die. So, that's...
Yeah,
I guess
it's tricky. It's tricky. It absolutely is.
All right. Well, we have so much to cover, so I don't want to belabor that point too much longer.
Right.
But I think that's a really interesting thing from this chapter that people should be attuned to. And then something else I thought was interesting as we made a little bit more progress through 16, 17 is that he entertains this scenario, and I think this is a massive problem with the text in general. And I was thinking I was going to wait till sort of our ultimate discussion to talk about it, but it's sort of intruding here on this particular question. He's like, let's just say everything is foreordained and that people aren't voluntarily choosing inordinate desire and therefore sinning and stuff like that. That we should in a way rejoice because then there's no real sin in the world. All of this is sort of orchestrated.
Right, and it's a question of sin by necessity.
Right.
Which is really, it's just problematic and troubling. It's troubling.
Well, here's why I found that problematic, right? So I said, all right, so if there are no sinners, we ought to praise God? I say, doesn't that make mass murderers equivalent to volcanoes? Doesn't this just amplify natural evil? Augustine hasn't given and may never address natural evil, a big problem in Donald Trump speak. What I'm trying to say here is, I got into this text on free choice of the will because I wanted it to solve the problem of evil. Mm-hmm. But guess what? This book on free choice of the will is really only covering human moral evil. Augustine hasn't talked about...
My question is, can you elaborate more on a definition of natural evil?
Yeah, so to cleave moral and natural evil is like the things that human beings actively choose, right?
Correct.
Whereas natural evil are things like earthquakes, typhoons, disease, blights.
Which are all terrible, but I mean, if we refer back to the text of our last podcast, this idea that everything in the universe has its most sublime and sort of upward limit, couldn't you posit that these things are absolutely tragic, but they're in terms of, I don't know, like say population control, and if an entire city gets wiped out by a natural disaster, then couldn't we just say that God's plan for people's temporal lives is changing, and their purpose is shifting towards something else?
Well, this becomes problem. So this would be kind of like the meta time that I'm talking about, right? Is that God is going so when I was talking about the meta time, the elements of meta time for me were like really cool things, like God becoming man and God resurrecting and God saving everybody. But what you're talking about, if there's this hidden plan, right, where God sends disease and hurricanes and stuff like that to kill people.
Because then that could be, but that could also
you have unjust suffering inflicted upon beings that aren't even choosing evil. Because if no one is voluntarily sinning and this stuff is being applied to them, you have all these beings.
Okay.
Suffering.
When you put it in that context, I was thinking more from a Puritan context where affliction was a sign that God loved you. So if God sent a plague to London, the Puritans would say, "Oh, God's keeping an eye on us because He's seen all the sinners and He sent us this plague to punish us."
Yeah.
God's keeping tabs on us. That's awesome. So that's sort of the different lens that I was viewing it with.
I think the lens change. If there are no sinners and God is still doing that stuff, then it's
right.
It's
exactly.
It makes
but when you take it out of a Protestant framework, that's where.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say here, but that's not. Augustine's obviously not going to endorse that scenario, as we're going to talk a little bit more. And the whole book is about on free choice, because Augustine does believe that we voluntarily sin and not necessarily sin. But I was just sort of entertaining that. But the more interesting question is that Augustine, even if we live in a world as voluntarily sinning and virtuous individuals, there's still natural evil in it. And has anything that Augustine said so far gotten God off the hook? He's gotten God off the hook in regards to our moral evil.
Right.
But has he gotten God off the hook in regards to volcanoes and disease? Or is that going to feed into sort of the Edenic fall when
it seems more compatible, right? I mean,
you brought up this quote last time about Satan, because Augustine talks a lot about Satan.
Right.
Can we start to see this realm as this sort of battleground between the light and the dark, and that if there are natural evil things that happen, that's really Satan interfering in God's creation, or that somehow when Adam and Eve ate of the apple and creation fell, that not only did it affect individuals, but the entire universe groans with sin, and everything is disrupted as a result of man falling from the garden. How is Augustine going to address these natural evil things? I don't think he adequately does it, but maybe we can sort of And maybe he takes it up in another book entirely. Great homework.
Maybe, City of God, maybe.
Yeah, maybe City of God.
Who knows?
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think about that?
It's so hard for me to really entertain the idea of natural evil because I feel like I could just somehow trace it back to people's own, moral.
So you're inclined to put it on people and not God.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
But how am I responsible for a volcano?
Well, you could say like a collective guilt of a city. Like if the town that we're in right now, if there's a typhoon, then I mean it's tempting to not chalk it up, but ascribe it to saying, well, this was a corrupt, evil town, and therefore we deserve to get obliterated. But yeah, it's hard to reconcile the two.
Yeah. There's maybe the Sodom and Gomorrah passage, right? Who was in Sodom and Gomorrah? Who were the characters in Sodom and Gomorrah? Was it Lot?
Yeah.
Lot, and he's like pleading with God, right. Like if there's like, don't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah if there's like 20 virtuous people.
Hold on. You know what? It comes down to the fact that what I've been doing in my unit lectures is this idea that you shouldn't even hold on to your temporal life. If you are a good person, you shouldn't worry about dying, because if your soul's in a good state, then
all that matters is your soul.
So maybe the idea of natural sin isn't too big of a concern for Augustine, because your physical integrity and your corporal frame isn't really that big of a deal.
And what difference does it make if you live to be 92 or 22?
Yeah, exactly. Like
so long as you're right with God, what difference does it make?
Yeah, I mean,
we're all going to die anyway.
Exactly. Like we're all going to die, and it seems like a unproductive use of your time and effort to focus on things that are temporal, and really you should you shouldn't be focused on things that are corporal, and then you should focus on things that are temporal and eternal.
Well, maybe this cosmic scheme could sort of mitigate the problem with natural evil as well, because we talked about how like if there are these which is latitude and which is longitude, which goes up.
Oh my gosh.
Is it latitude?
Latitude, yeah.
Okay. So if there are these latitudinal moves within the cosmic order, right? And God obliterates the city.
I'm going to Google that right after this.
Yeah. I wish we had a
Oh gosh.
We should know basic geography.
We should know that.
I think it's latitude.
Yeah.
I think it's latitude.
Right.
But if there are these diagonal and latitudinal moves and maybe even longitudinal moves, which we'll talk about today with sin and souls, oh my God, you can make longitudinal moves on this model.
It's crazy. Yeah.
We should make a game about the divine cosmic order. It's like
gosh.
Connect Four, divine shoots and ladders. But if you can make these sort of latitudinal and longitudinal and diagonal moves and stuff like that, if God annihilates a city with a hurricane or something like that, God just needed those people somewhere else in the cosmic order.
Exactly. I think that's kind
God's just moving stuff around.
Yeah.
God's just doing a little bit of celestial planning.
Right.
He's just the ultimate. He's just the
like
ultimate
a landscaper.
Yeah, he's just landscaping the universe.
Yeah.
You okay with that?
Oddly enough, yeah. I mean,
you seem remarkably cool with it. I don't know. It keeps me up.
Yeah. Again, I don't know.
Okay.
Hijacked by the text.
All right. Well, we'll just move on. So
I have good faith.
Yeah. I'm obviously deficient. So again, so they close out the chapters 16 through 17, talking a little bit about where man is within the order. I didn't really think it added too much to what we had already talked about, but things start to get pretty crazy in chapters 18 through 19. Let me take a look at my notes again. Can you take charge for a second?
I think one thing that just drove me absolutely batty about chapter 18 is will and the cause of the will. That just like drove me kind of crazy. He kind of goes through the motions of the cause of the will. If the will submits to the cause of the will, then it's just for the will to submit. If the will can resist the cause of the will, then there's no sin that takes place. And then he talks about deception.
What does he say about deception? I don't remember that.
He says that if the will is deceived by the cause of the will, then there's no sin. And then if the will lets itself become deceived by the cause of the will, then it's sin. And that kind of reminded me a little bit of bad faith, a little bit. Yeah. Of this idea of letting yourself, or like your will letting itself get deluded by things. And that put constraints on like the reality and like what's really going on. And
do you want to develop it a little bit more? Or do you want to?
No, I mean I just jotted it down. I don't know. It just seems as if you could say if your will is deluded, then I don't know where I was going with this. I was going somewhere. I kind of lost my train of thought on that one. To be honest, it just seems as if that. If you let your will become deceived, then you can buy into a bunch of delusions that aren't really there.
So what do we do to protect ourselves?
Which seems irrational. Let your will, I don't know, just not become duped. Yeah. Right?
Well, I mean, I think
easier said than done.
Well, I think the big thing for that is going to be the primordial sort of thing that we keep going back to is to really cultivate reason and wisdom and faith. I mean, that
safeguards
and the virtues are going to sort of allow us to these supreme virtues of prudence, fortitude, and temperance, and what was the other one? Justice.
Yes.
Yeah, that these are going to be the things that ultimately prevent delusion. Okay. Chapter 18, chapter 19. There's a lot going to be. Yeah. To talk about here. Okay.
And that was just like what I just talked about was like the opening, not even like the meat of
all right. This is what I think 18. Is like the meat of this. Yeah. Okay. It's like Avotius is like, well, why? Yeah. Why were men so cursed that they have to have this plight of suffering and being lower in the order?
Yeah. What did we ever do?
And Augustine's going to say, hey.
Guess what?
Hey, dummy. Guess what? Man was built for the good, just like the angels, right? Whatever that really means. But he was constituted like the angels at some point. Mm-hmm. Whatever that means. I don't know what the distinction is between Adam and the angels.
Right. We're not going to go into that, but.
But he's going to say here, when Adam and Eve fell out of Eden, it fundamentally transformed the character of humanity.
Yep.
So there is a shift in the cosmic order. We hinted at this before, and I got all sort of wrapped up in all these, the shifting of the cosmic order and what that meant for God and stuff like that. And you can take that and run with it. Okay, the cosmic order shifts because the apple or whatever. He's going to say, now we're getting into original sin.
Right.
What? Fine if Adam and Eve move down, make a latitudinal move downward in the cosmic order, but why do Luke and Jordan, millennia later, right? Why do we have to pay for that, and how are we paying for that? How we're paying for that is through some sort of transmission. You and I have been lowered in the order so that we are more governed by ignorance and immoderate desire and or cupidity than Adam and Eve were before the fall. Mm-hmm. So in every generation of human is going to be more governed by these things than in the original cosmic order. So original sin, partly defined, is going to be the fact that we are more beholden to inordinate desire and stupidity than the first beings.
Right.
And you go with that.
I mean, I think it was it Paul or Augustine quotes Paul and says that we are enslaved to flesh, which is pretty crazy. And Augustine makes
Does that mean Adam and Eve didn't have the same sort of flesh that we do?
I wonder.
Because they were made of.
That's kind of what I was wondering. I mean, the cool thing is that Augustine says that God allowed humans to perpetuate and be fruitful. Like, cool. Thank you, God, for that. But yeah, that we're sort of condemned to. What were the two? It was ignorance and difficulty, right? Mm. Those were like the things that we were sort of afflicted with in this.
Difficulty being defined as the inordinate desire that we have to constantly overcome.
The difficulty is the affliction, and then the ignorance is what plays into the inordinate desire.
Yeah.
That because we are essentially blinded by our own ignorance, and we just sort of persist in chasing one inordinate desire after another.
Right.
We're like dogs chasing cars.
Fortuitously, we have at least wisdom that allows us to rein in the inordinate desire to some
which
degree.
is the natural judgment that we're imbued with. And it's just like awesome, the fact that we have this natural judgment. And it's it's just fascinating that Augustine says that there's no one keeping us in that hole of ignorance. You know, in a way, we become prisoners of our own minds.
Yeah.
And our own souls. And the door's open of the prison cell. You can walk out anytime you want, but we're held back by our own ignorance to see that the door's open and that we can just walk out.
I like that analogy. It reminds me of like people who like. It reminds me of like some sort of metaphor where like you've got all these prisoners and they're assuming they've been locked up, and like you're just like, hey, no, I never turned the key. It was
exactly.
It was there the entire time.
No.
But you assume you're in prison. So this raised a lot of questions for me. I'm just going to read off my notes.
Sure.
Because
go for it.
Yeah. So some of the questions I had by this conceptualization here was, is punishment a corruption of our body or our soul?
Yeah.
Okay. Is punishment biological or is it transmitted between souls?
Ooh.
Does that mean our souls are traced back to Adam? Is all humanity one soul? So what happened in Adam's soul happens in ours. Don't we have individual souls? How does sin transmit from one soul to another? Okay, we're not going to be able to answer this right now. But those are the things.
Absolutely not.
But he's going to go and try to take a stab at this over the next 4 chapters. But those were some of the things. We'll get into. I'm not even going to speculate on this stuff right now because we'll answer those as we go along into the stuff that's coming next.
Right.
But I'll say this: what's really interesting here is, and we talked about this while we were having lunch. How many podcasts have we talked about the soul in?
None.
We have not
Zilch.
talked about the
Zero.
soul. What have we talked about?
Oh my gosh. Reason. We've talked about wisdom, sort of the natural order.
The will,
yeah.
Appetite, sense, the inner sense, stuff like that. We have not talked about this entity known as the soul. Nope. Okay. So,
not at all.
And Augustine is going to start talking over the next 4 chapters or 3 chapters. Augustine is going to start talking about the soul as if we already know what that is. Well, Jordan, what's the soul?
I don't know.
I don't know either. But it seems like, at least it seems like the soul is all these things that we've talked about, like reason, wisdom, appetites, inner sense perceptions, that these are things that the soul either experiences as the result of being in a body or are the constitutive elements of the soul. But I don't think you could say reason is soul.
No.
I don't think you could say will is soul. I don't think you could say appetites are soul. And here's the thing, because you can't say that any of those individual things are soul, I think you're going to make the case that not only do humans have a soul, but other things within the divine schematization that are below it also have souls.
Right.
And I think you're going to be, because you can't identify, you might have to say that animals have a type of soul. And maybe going back to the resources that I hinted at earlier, and you and I were talking, like, where is Augustine getting this? Because it's a different conception of soul, because I think a lot of people think about souls as a lot of people think about souls being something that only humans have.
Right, like it's something that like humans are only privileged with.
Right. Now, Augustine doesn't say here that there are animal souls.
Right.
But given the way he has talked about the constitution of beings and everything else, if the soul is not one of these things, but is something that maybe activates the body or was married to the body or something like that, you could start talking about there being all different types of souls. And when you and I were talking about earlier, that this may be the Aristotelian influence on Augustine. I'm only speculating because Augustine takes that more holistic view of the soul in a book called De Anima, which is an amazing book. And I think maybe one day we'll cover it, but I don't know. I mean, you're the classicist. I mean, what do you have to?
Oh boy.
Yeah. I mean, is there anything that any light that you can shed on where he's like possibly getting this concept of soul? I hate to put you on the spot. I mean, I know, like, I didn't ask you to prepare any of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's leaning towards everything has some sort of a life force. I mean, that's kind of, animus, what that literally means is like it's a life breath. So it's something that's intrinsic in everything that lives. That's about as best I can, scratch the surface with that. So even just me going off of the idea of an animus, it's a spirit. So I think that everything that lives that's animated, right, would have some sort of life breath or life force behind it.
Yeah. If I can remember correctly, I think Aristotle talks about there being vegetative souls, like even plants would have types of souls, and then they're animal souls, and then and the concept of the soul kind of nests and shells like the Russian dolls. But I don't quote me on Aristotle. I've done no prep work on Aristotle.
Yeah.
So
not either.
Let's proceed into Book 3, Chapter 20, because I think Augustine's going to give us 3 ways to answer that cluster truck of questions that I just rolled out. So he considers a couple of alternatives for how we can think about the soul. And then in chapters 21 through 22, he's going to give 4 distinct views of the soul. But so in chapter 20, he says, first, if there is one soul that all individual souls are fashioned from, we are just a further manifestation of our Father and rightly deserve punishment being visited upon us. So if there's one soul, that means that Adam is still alive in you and me.
Yeah,
and in the fact that we continue to experience disease and blight and mortality and stuff like that.
Is a direct punishment for that transgression.
For Adam. Adam set this all in motion, so it's okay for God to punish us because we are just... You and I are just different shells. We are just different mass of the original Adam soul.
Right. Yeah.
Why might that be problematic? I could see that being why would that be problematic on
right, because what we talked about, because it's going to ultimately be traced back to God then, right?
Well, not if Adam had autonomy. I think the problem the problem that I'm going with this is that it totally annihilates individuality, right?
Right, and the whole it just totally runs that's okay. I'm glad that you brought that up because it runs completely counter to Augustine's emphasis on the accountability of the individual.
Right. And the whole point of Christianity is that God incarnate is to save the individual, is to let the prisoners out of the prison, and God loving the little children and God loving everybody, that there's no talk in Christianity of God saving the world soul. Or it's
Absolutely.
God saving people. Right. The person, the individual, that God became a person to save persons, not
exactly,
not
people with a capital P.
Not the person.
Right.
God became flesh not to save the person; He became flesh to save persons. It's totally at odds with what we think of basic Christian theology. Is the problem that I have with this.
Yeah, and not to mention, it speaks to what we were talking about on the way over here, is the concept of people having a personal relationship with their God is huge.
Yeah.
The Romans They absolutely did not have a personal or snuggly or nice relationship with their gods. This idea of the individual soul is much more fitting for the much more personalized relationship with God.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say that Augustine's going to probably not subscribe to that view. He's merely sort of entertaining it, but right. I can see why. I'm just putting forth there why, even further reason why we should entertain it. But then he goes on to say, even if our souls are fashioned independently of Adam's soul, Augustine doesn't have a problem with punishment. And the reason why is that, like we've talked about already, we should be grateful for existing at all.
Yep,
and that really we should use the punishment that God has given us as the result of our Edenic fall, the fact that we have inordinate desire and dumbness and cupidity and stuff like that. It's not a curse. Original sin is not a curse. It's a blessing.
Right, because...
Why is it a blessing?
It's because you have the power to reform yourself and restore your soul with God's help.
God has given us adversity so we can draw closer to him.
Exactly.
So suffering is a blessing.
Makes you closer to God, which is...
What do you think about that? So hurricanes, cancer, immoderate desire.
Right,
all
so just
stuff.
what we talked about earlier in the podcast, right? This idea of it totally just kind of... It seems in my mind just kind of like wipes clean this like slate of natural sin of just, affliction's good for us, so there we go.
Are you so you're once again you're okay with that? I mean, had we not fallen, would we?
I would say this is a pretty good alternative. You know what I mean?
I guess what I'm trying to say is, I wonder if we're actually able to become closer to God as the result of falling. Maybe when we, in the pre-fall state, it was just mere dumb harmony with God, whereas this we actually have to work for.
At it.
It's like the difference between inheriting $1 million and earning $1 million. Right. Like, you don't appreciate the thing that you inherit, but you have ultimate respect for the thing that you work for. But the problem with this is that there are going to be people that are left behind.
But... they chose to get left behind.
Yeah, I mean, but
they haven't left the cell yet.
I know, but God's going, but God is going to punish them for their ignorance and cupidity.
Yeah,
He's going to take it out on the dumb animal people.
Right, and this is kind of the thing that I have. The only issue I have is Augustine is a cultural elite. He's a producer. So he's going to be literate, and assuming the people who would be probably like most saved would probably be the people reading this sort of stuff. You know?
I don't know. I mean, that's interesting. We're transmitting Augustine's thought. I wonder if we're going to bring anybody over to God or whatever through this podcast. I mean, that's not the point. We're not trying to evangelize through philosophy, but we're taking Augustine's ideas, and I wonder if someone's listening to us and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna be saved now. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but you said it's a fact. You said that this work is worked on you.
Yeah, it certainly has. It just kind of makes me wonder that would someone have a greater likelihood of being saved if they read this text and they said, oh my God, I am trapped. I need to find that door to salvation.
What do you think? Has it brought you closer to God? I know it's super personal. Maybe you don't want to say this.
Yeah, no, I would definitely say it's given me a new perspective on things.
See, I'm already I'm already I'm part of the choir. Mm-hmm. So, but so it is preaching to the choir. But I would say I'm a
healthy skeptic, but this has definitely given me a new appreciation for it.
I would say this has deepened my relationship with God.
Yeah.
But I was already a Christian to begin with. Mm-hmm. I mean, not always, but before this text, I was a Christian.
Right.
And now my faith is probably deeper. Mm-hmm. But maybe it'd be interesting to know what it does for a secular person who may be skeptical of God. In general, does it make them more inclined to believe in Christ? Does it? I don't know. I can't say. I can only say my own subjective experience.
Right.
So, but do you want to say anything about that? And your answer does not matter. I'm not going to hold it against you. We don't have an agenda here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that it's interesting because I was raised Catholic, and getting back to the original teachings, once you kind of take away all the trappings, so to speak, of Catholicism, and you kind of see it more of its bare bones, it's really easy to see why this is so appealing.
If I were to make a diagnosis of you, it sounds like would this be,
yeah.
If I were to make a diagnosis of you, I think before reading this text you were like, no thank you. No thank you to Catholicism or Christianity.
Hard pass.
Or, you're like,
yeah.
But it seems like this text has made Christianity and Catholicism intellectually respectable to you, but you haven't decided whether or not to go over to it entirely. Would that be wrong?
No, I think that's definitely a fair assessment.
Cool. That's interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see what pushes you over the edge.
Yeah.
May I recommend Kierkegaard?
Yeah. Okay.
So because that's I think that's what did it for me, to be honest. If anyone's interested, you should check out Kierkegaard. He's awesome. And there's a lot of what Augustine says that you could say contributed to the existentialism of Kierkegaard. Mm-hmm. So that's a book for somebody to write, a paper to write, something like that. But so something I thought was super interesting about this conception of it being sort of transmitted individually, and that souls being developed independently, is it actually looks like Augustine thinks sin is transmitted biologically and not through souls, meaning immoderate desire is passed on through the body.
Yeah.
And that's like totally insane because, we'll set this up in a second, is that the original sin is not applied to the soul. The original sin is applied to our bodies, and the body becomes corrupted in the process of the eating of the apple, and humanity's body, the human body becomes totally distorted. And maybe there's some, because I know there was in the Old Testament, there are some individuals that lived a lot longer than others, really like 1,000 years or something like that, and I think there was maybe this idea that there was some sort of, you could sort of perfect the body a little bit, but ultimately that it was fallen. But the idea here is that the sin seems to be pervading the physical vessel that is the human, and if the souls are individualized, then the souls come from somewhere.
Yeah.
Get into our bodies.
They just kind of like walk in.
They walk in.
Just float in or something.
They get in there somehow. Yeah. And that somehow these souls get in there, and the souls somehow make it possible that humanity can be saved from the corrosive acts, the corrosive nature of sin that penetrates the body.
What?
Had you ever heard of that before?
I mean, I read it.
Did you ever entertain that idea before, ever?
No, I don't. It's kind of. It just seems like, I don't know, like in Hercules with all like the souls like floating around and like getting pushed into like people's body. Like, it was some weird stuff. I still don't get it. I'm still perplexed by it.
Well, in chapters 21 and 22, Augustine's going to take up maybe the different ways that souls can get into bodies. Mm-hmm. I had some questions here about this view of sin being transmitted through the body and not through souls or whatever. I said, why would God risk sending souls into humans? This soul may end up not being saved. Why must souls be dragged down here and perhaps descend lower? Right?
Yeah.
Why not just let man generate and die like every other creature? Why can't we just be like deer that propagate and then die? And like there's no heaven for us or anything like that. But because God, and maybe this reinforces this uniqueness of humanity, God is sending souls down to make sure that we as individuals don't perish like all the other animals.
Right.
Which says something maybe about the human soul and not so much the animal soul. It seems like maybe animal souls...
There's some sort of favoritism for the human soul?
Yeah.
Or something...
That there seems to be something maybe emergent about the animal soul.
Or maybe there's some sort of likeness that our souls have with God. You know, if we're made in God's likeness, maybe there's like a little bit of favoritism somehow.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of favoritism. And that's what Augustine's trying to say is that, well, we may not, you know, we may not be angels, but we're definitely very special to God. And we spent a lot of last podcast. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. At the end of chapter 20, Augustine entertains also that souls find their ways into bodies. We've already talked about that. And so, just like souls may find a way, it may not be up to God. They just kind of meander into there, but it doesn't matter how they get in there because God gives us the incarnation a way to get out of the prison. He gives us the key. It's like someone bakes the cake, like to break their boyfriend out of jail, and they're like, there's like here's the key or the saw that's going to allow you to break out of the prison. Christ is like the cake with the saw inside that like you see in like old timey cartoons or something like that,
or like The Great Escape. Like, or it's like here's a spoon to like dig out from under yourself.
How do they smuggle the spoons into prison in Alcatraz or that?
I have no idea.
Yeah, well, whatever.
Over my head.
Yeah. But I think we should move to chapters 21 through 22 because here he's going to more to flesh out more directly what those views of the souls are. So Augustine itemizes 4 views of the souls, and he says this, that at the time of his writing, which we're in what the late 4th or early 5th century, the church had not really decided and I don't know what the church thinks now. We probably need to bring in a Catholic expert or something like that, what the church actually thinks about the nature of the soul now. But he says at this time, it's unsettled doctrine within the church what the heck the soul is. And that's why he's entertaining all these possibilities. And he enumerates 4 options of how souls get into bodies or what the soul is, all right? And the first one is propagation brings souls into existence. Okay, that somehow when the body reproduces, then maybe another soul is made as well, and it sort of just emerges out of the biological composition of man. I didn't really quite understand what that meant. We'll go back and address it. A soul is created for each person born. So when, if you should ever have a child, like,
there you go.
God's let me make a soul up here. It's brewing up there, and then like it's
give it to you.
It's married.
We're good to go.
Maybe they come together at the moment of inception, or maybe maybe God like eases it into your womb, or I don't know. Do you really like me talking about your womb? Sorry. I would talk about mine, but I don't have one.
That's fine.
I'm sorry. I've made you confess your faith commitments, what you think about. We've talked about your
possibilities of my womb.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Getting raked across the coals.
I'm really sorry. In the third view, he says souls exist elsewhere and are commanded into a newborn, right? So like maybe God has souls in the cosmic order that are like, they're just
floating around.
They're just prepared from all time. He made them at the beginning of the universe.
Maybe they're just like sitting on a rack.
They're just like hanging up there with God, like playing volleyball in heaven or something like that. And then like you get pregnant. Again, we're using you again.
Right, thanks.
Not me. You get pregnant. It's like, hey, Jim, I got some work for you to do on Earth.
Yeah.
Go live in that lady.
Go like occupy this space for like a little bit.
Yeah, I need you to go do some work for me. Yeah. That's a crazy idea. And then an idea that we've already talked about is that souls attach to bodies at their own discretion. That like God may not be making a new soul or commanding souls, that they just kind of like find their way in there.
Yeah,
like,
they sink into bodies by their own choice.
True. So
I mean, especially that one. Like God's such a careful craftsman and a creator. Like that just seems, I don't know, like just kind of out of character with the God that Augustine characterizes.
Well, this seemed so I took issues with the first and the fourth. He's going to give us a litmus test for determining. He doesn't know what the right view is because he's ultimately going to say, hey, guess what? I've got bigger fish to fry. This question is not really that interesting to me. And probably...
So for him, it's like a side. It's more like a side issue than anything else.
Yeah, Augustine's ultimately going to be interested in what's going to allow him to love his neighbor and love God. Right. So all this discussion about souls or whatever he thinks is distracting. Just like last time I got hung up on meta time and splitting universes and things like that. But... on the face of it, now I'm going to talk about his litmus test in a second. On the face of it, the first and fourth conceptions of the soul seem problematic to me, because if the soul is sort of propagated, it would seem like there's not really this distinction between the biological transmission of sin and the transmission of sin via souls. It seems like if they sort of like emerge as the result of human procreation, that souls are stained. And we've kind of already gotten this idea established that that sin is transmitted genetically, unless we say something to the effect of they start out pristine and then become stained as the organism starts to grow and grow and grow. More. Yeah, so like maybe the individual. But then that's problematic, because then at what point does the individual's body corrupted? Is it corrupted at birth? Is it corrupted in inception? At the moment that we're conceived, is the body fallen? Because it's the
beginning of the end.
It's the moment you start living. It's the moment you also start dying. Right?
That's depressing. Yeah.
Well, if it's true. It's true, right? There's
that's true. It's hard to argue against it.
Unless you want to take the view that like some sort of biological view where when the body can't replace the cells fast enough, that's when you start dying, which some biologists use to define the sort of the arc of the organism. But But I mean, really viewed cosmically, the second you become something, the second you enter into becoming, you just get that much closer to your end.
Yeah.
Whereas if you exist in eternity and never become, you never end. Mm-hmm. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So we need to wrap things up, because we have other people coming into our room. The other issue that I had problems with was the fourth version of the version that he said was that souls sort of meandering into bodies. I thought that personally challenged God's dominion in some way.
Yeah, that's kind of how I took it, is that if God is like this careful creator and sort of, he made things in such a very organized way that it seems almost haphazard.
Yeah, it doesn't really... But maybe God wanted it that way. I mean, maybe God wanted to give souls that sort of freedom.
Gave us free will.
So I mean, maybe he wants it that way.
Yeah.
But Augustine does give us a litmus test to determine, and I don't know if maybe we'll have to pick this up next podcast, because we have someone else coming in here. But he gives us a litmus test for determining what the right view of the soul is. I was hoping to apply this, and he gives us 3 criteria to judge it by. So the version of the soul has to affirm that God's creation is only changeable in form, that the soul cannot evolve, that the soul is something that is immutable like God. Yeah. 2, the view cannot impute changeableness into God. That would be at odds with God's eternality. Yeah, right. And 3, it cannot challenge the Trinity. So whatever view of the soul that we want to take, it's got to fit those criteria. Yeah. Now, I think it'd be a very helpful exercise, and maybe we should save it for next time.
And we should, definitely. Because we'll have to table that for next time.
But I think it'd be a very effective exercise to apply this litmus test to the 4 views of the soul and see what happens. Maybe we can determine that the most endearing view of this. But given my own standards, it looked like the second and third were the least problematic. Mm-hmm. That of a soul being created for each person that was born, or that souls exist elsewhere and commanded into a newborn. Right. That seems to fit best with what Augustine has laid out with the cosmic order, that sin is transmitted biologically and not between souls. And doesn't seem to challenge his dominion.
Right.
Okay.
So we should get this wrapped up.
Yeah, we should get this wrapped up. Yeah, you're like, let's get out of here. Okay, guys, next week.
Okay, bye, guys.
We'll finish the whole book next week, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. All right, bye.
Okay, see ya.